Standby open. Roll tapes. Standby announcer in 3, 2, 1.
This is the News Center Night Beat.
The bodies of 2 Air National Guard pilots are back in Fort Smith tonight. Major Douglas Coleman and Captain Richard Lumpkin died last week when their F-4 Phantom fighter jet went down in a remote area of southern Scott County as they were practicing combat flight maneuvers. Tonight, the bodies of the 2 men arrived in Fort Smith by C-130 aircraft and have been turned over to the families. Funeral services for Major Coleman will be held at 10 o'clock Thursday morning at First Lutheran Church in Fort Smith. Services for Captain Lumpkin are scheduled for 9 a.m. Wednesday at the First Baptist Church in Charleston.
Jury selection moves slow in the murder trial of a 28-year-old Spiro man.
In Scott County. Funeral services for Captain Lumpkin will be held Wednesday. Services for Major Coleman will be Thursday. The inquiry into the cause of the crash still continues.
And it looks like Fort Chaffee could become a year-round training facility. Fort Chaffee is one of 3.
Well, because he's considering seeking the death penalty in the case. Testimony is expected.
The systems operator was on a routine training maneuver when he and Major Douglas Coleman crashed into a mountain in Scott County. Coleman, who was piloting the plane, also died. His funeral is tomorrow.
As the families of the pilots grieve, a team of various Air Force experts are descending the jet fuel a week after the crash. And there are other unnatural things in this burned-out section of the woods. People meticulously inspecting every piece of metal and wire lying on the ground. With pink and orange ribbons marking important places where the plane went down. These tiny pieces may not look like much to the average person, but investigators say they can put the pieces together to find out why the plane went down. Everything the team of experts finds that can be identified will be labeled, then plotted on a giant graph. Colonel Skip Yo says the team will scrutinize every aspect of the failed mission, the plane's structure and maintenance, its operations, and lastly, the possibility that the crash could have been operator error.
I don't want to look at that as a primary cause. Being an operator myself, I like to think that the pilot was doing everything in his power to fly the airplane safely. So it's certainly not an area we rule out. We have to look at that.
Colonel Yo and his associates have 30 days to finish their inspection and explain why the plane crashed. Until that time is up, they'll keep fitting the small pieces together, hoping the big story will fall into place.
When the special session of the state legislature,
when their Phantom 4 jet slammed into a hillside. Investigators are still trying to determine the cause of the crash, but say that it could take weeks to find the answer. Following services in Charleston, Lumpkin's body was taken to the National Cemetery in Little Rock for burial. Memorial funds for Lumpkin and Douglas have been established at the Air National Guard in Fort Smith. Funeral services for Coleman will be held at 10 tomorrow morning at the First Lutheran Church in Fort Smith.
Despite protests all across the country, President Reagan today scored a major
8 years, received full military honors. Following this solemn service, 4 F-4 Phantom fighters flew overhead in a missing man formation. Lumpkin and Major Doug Coleman were flying on an F-4 training mission last week when it crashed near Waldron, Arkansas. Officials haven't determined the cause of the crash. The loss of the 2 men was particularly tragic for the 188th Tactical Fighter Group at Fort Smith. They were the first to die on duty in the group's 22-year history.
We have a group of about a total of a little less than 900 people, and one of our members described it, I thought, very well, very adequately the other day when they said, we're a family and we've lost 2 of our brothers. I think that pretty well says it.
Lumpkin, like his father George, a World War II veteran, are now buried here at the Little Rock National Cemetery. He's survived by his wife and 2 sons who live in Charleston, Arkansas. John Dewey, News Scene 7.
Services for Major Coleman will be held at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at Fort Smith. He will be buried with full military honors at the Fort Smith National Cemetery.
Than the rest of us would if we lived to be 100. Captain Richard E. Lumpkin was buried this afternoon at the National Cemetery in Little Rock. Reporting for the News Center, Mark McDonald, Charleston.
National Guardsmen who were killed when their plane crashed last Wednesday. Services for 31-year-old Captain Richard Lumpkin were followed by his burial at the National Cemetery in Little Rock. Lumpkin and 32-year-old Major Douglas Coleman were killed when their Phantom 4 jet fighter slammed into a hillside near Waldron. Services for Coleman will be held at the First Lutheran Church in Fort Smith tomorrow morning. He will be buried at the National Cemetery in Fort Smith.
Family gathered today to pay their last respects to Captain Richard E. Lumpkin. At the First Baptist Church of Charleston, he was eulogized by Pastor Larry Horn, who knew Lumpkin as a child in Jones Mill and as an adult in Charleston. Captain Richard E. Lumpkin was buried this afternoon at the National Cemetery in Little Rock.
On the
family of Major Douglas Coleman and the 188th Tactical Air Wing paid final respects to a husband, a father, a comrade in arms. Today's funeral comes the day after Captain Richard Lumpkin was eulogized in Charleston. The News Center's Miles Saunders reports.
Major Douglas Coleman was known in life as a crack fighter pilot, one of the best. Today he was remembered in death as a good father and a buddy. This morning's funeral at Fort Smith's First Lutheran Church filled the sanctuary with Air Force personnel and those who knew Coleman. His death, said Pastor Fred Hagemeyer, makes those who knew him realize that they are all like family. The funeral procession made its way to the Fort Smith National Cemetery, where under the warm sun of summer, a field of men and women in Air Force blue looked on.
Aim! Fire! Aim! Fire!
The deaths of Coleman and Lumpkin leave many questions to be answered. Air Force investigators say it may take as much as a month to figure out why their F-4 crashed in what has been described as a routine training mission. But for today, the question was not why did the plane crash, but why were two men in the prime of life, both with families, so suddenly taken? For the News Center, Miles Saunders, Fort Smith.
They found him guilty of...
Major Doug Coleman was laid to rest at the Fort Smith National Cemetery. Coleman was one of two men who died when his F-4 fighter plowed into the ground in a remote area of Scott County last week. The other man who died in that crash, Captain Richard Lumpkin, was buried yesterday. The fighter was practicing low-level maneuvers when the crash happened. No finding yet on the cause.
Well, patrons of the Club West in Coleman, the second of two Air National Guardsmen buried this week. Coleman and Captain Richard Lumpkin, buried yesterday, were killed last Wednesday when their Phantom 4 jet crashed during a routine mission. Gina Curry reports.
The stern faces of fellow guardsmen spoke louder than words. The grim mood followed to the National Cemetery. They're paying last respects to a man as dear to them as a brother, 32-year-old Major Douglas Coleman. He and Captain Richard Lumpkin died when their jet fighter crashed into a hillside near Waldron.
Our brother whose body we now...
Words from the minister comforted friends and family.
Lo, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound and the dead will...
Emotions heightened when Phantom fighters flew over in missing man formation. The ceremony marks a final tribute to Major Coleman and his partner, but the spirit of sacrifice these men accepted to ensure our freedom will live on. For the News People, I'm Gina Curry.
And officials are still trying to determine the cause of the crash.
Major Coleman and Captain Lumpkin were members of the Fort Smith Air National Guard unit, which has one of the best safety records in the nation, despite the fact that the unit flies some of the oldest F-4 Phantom jet fighters still in existence. Tim Ryan reports.
The F-4 Phantom is the oldest fighter flown in the United States, and the 188th has the oldest of the oldest. Number 411 was the third F-4 to roll off the assembly line back in 1963. The other two were either lost in Vietnam or otherwise scrapped, making number 411 the oldest F-4 flying.
Most all the countries in the free world are still using the F-4 aircraft in one version or another. Okay. There is 10 different versions of the F-4. Unfortunately, we have the oldest one.
The 188th gets F-4s because when the Air Force gets newer planes, it passes on its old ones to Air National Guard units. It's pure chance that the 188th got number 411, and while Guardsmen like having this piece of history here, they also look forward to working with some newer models.
It kind of gives you a little bit feeling of pride to be able to take these and go up against other Guard units and regular Air Force units and do as good or better than they do.
But you'll be happy to get newer.
Oh, yes. It'd be easier to work on.
Sergeant Timmons says the 188th could get newer planes, a more advanced model of the F-4, by the end of the year. Now, number 411 probably won't end up in a museum. Chances are it'll end up in the desert of Arizona. All retired planes are taken to the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base to be used for spare parts. Tim Ryan for the News People.
By the way, one of the planes that was with the Flyers when they went down last week was the third Phantom jet fighter ever made. It's still flying today.
Coming up next.
That obscured the wooded hills of eastern Scott County. The plane was one of 3 F-4s flying a routine training mission for the 188th Tactical Fighter Group based in Fort Smith. The planes were practicing a low-level bombing and strafing run just south of the town of Harvey. Air Guard officials said they were flying at an altitude of less than 300 feet when one of the planes slammed into the side of a ridge. The crash immediately touched off a fire that spread rapidly. Aboard the plane were 2 men, a weapons specialist, 31-year-old Captain Richard Lumpkin of Charleston, and the pilot, 32-year-old Major Douglas Coleman of Barling. Air Guard officials described Coleman as one of the unit's top pilots. The plane apparently disintegrated upon impact. Most of the pieces of metal that littered the crash site were small enough to be carried. The pilots of the 2 remaining planes said Coleman never hinted at any problems over the radio prior to the crash. Air Force investigators will spend the next few days sifting through the rubble of the crash to determine its cause. The F-4 is considered one of the most reliable jets currently in use by the Air Force. Reporting for the News People, I'm Mark Drury. The colors are flying at half-mast over the 188th. Although quiet, flight operations continues to function as pilots prepare for training runs. It was during a low-altitude combat scenario when one of the Flying Razorbacks F-4 Phantoms exploded into the Ouachita National Forest yesterday. Pilot 32-year-old Major Douglas Coleman and weapons officer 31-year-old Captain Richard Lumpkin were reportedly killed instantly. It was less than 2 months ago when the Flying Razorbacks returned to Fort Smith, National Guard champions. Their ace pilot, Major Douglas Coleman.
The various competitions that he was involved with, if he was not the winner, he was always right up at the very top. And in most cases, he was right there in the winner's circle in the competitions.
Expertise with the F-4 Phantom takes years of experience, but even though Captain Lumpkin had been with this unit for only a year, they respected this man they called Lumpy.
Oh, just super. If I could get a whole unit full of Lumpies, I'd take them.
The Flying Razorback's safety record was the best. For a jet fighter unit, its years without an accident were bettered by none. But today, the men of this unit mourn the death of 2 of their comrades, 2 of their friends. Corey Barron for the News People. Air National Guard personnel were solemn as a C-130 arrived in Fort Smith Monday evening, bearing the bodies of the 2 guardsmen killed in a training accident last week. An Air Force Honor Guard stood silently as the flag-draped coffins of Major Douglas Coleman and Captain Richard Lumpkin were carried off the plane. A memorial service for Lumpkin is scheduled for tomorrow in Charleston. Coleman will be buried in Fort Smith on Thursday. But while preparations were being made to mourn the 2 deaths, Air Force investigators continue to look into the cause of the tragic accident that claimed their lives. This morning, the members of the investigative team began looking at videotape of the crash site, hoping for some indication as to how the plane went down. Team leader Colonel Skip Yo has been sifting through the rubble of the crash site daily, but no conclusions have been made. Information is still being gathered. The F-4 jet broke into pieces and burst into flames following impact, so physical evidence has been hard to come by. Yo says he has 30 days in which to wrap up his investigation. A final report will be given to the head of the Tactical Air Command at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. Reporting for the News People, I'm Mark Drury.
The stern faces of fellow guardsmen spoke louder than words. The grim mood followed to the National Cemetery. They're paying last respects to a man as dear to them as a brother, 32-year-old Major Douglas Coleman. He and Captain Richard Lumpkin died when their jet fighter crashed into a hillside near Waldron.
Our brother whose body we now...
Words from the minister comforted friends and family.
Lo, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound and the dead will...
Emotions heightened when phantom fighters flew over in missing man formation. The ceremony marks a final tribute to Major Coleman and his partner. But the spirit of sacrifice these men accepted to ensure our freedom will live on. For the News People, I'm Gina Curry.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with an easy grace where never lark nor even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
F-4 fighter plane. Bits and pieces of the jet lay scattered over a 400-yard radius. A huge burned out in the forest marks the spot where the plane blew up. The Air National Guard and area authorities are still trying to figure out what went wrong.
The members of the aircrew members in the other two planes, they were involved in a routine training flight, and we have no indications of any problems whatsoever.
The military is keeping tight security at the crash site. They've sealed off a large area of the forest, and an armed guard is keeping sightseers away from the wreckage. Forest rangers are standing by here to put out fires that might be ignited by smoldering parts of the plane. Meanwhile, the Air National Guard is keeping people out here until the investigation is over. That could be 2 or 3 days. They'll have the grisly job of collecting parts of their comrade's plane which withstood the impact of the crash. It's hoped that sifting through the rubble will help explain the worst accident involving the Fort Smith unit of the Air Guard in the last 15 years. This is an unfamiliar setting for the Fort Smith Air Guard. For years, the group called the Flying Razorbacks has boasted one of the best safety records in the country. None of their pilots have ever been killed while flying with the Guard, so morning is a new experience.
It's caused time for reflection and coming to grips with the reality of living and dying, and I think it will, in the long run, will enrich us, and that they've certainly made their mark with us, and they won't be forgotten.
In a news conference this morning, officers said Coleman and Lumpkin were on a training mission in pursuit of an enemy jet. They were in the middle of a 90-degree turn, flying as low as 300 feet at 500 miles an hour when the plane began to go down.
We don't know what caused this particular accident. It could have been an aircraft malfunction, a flight control problem, or we just don't know.
However, in the type of flight they were on, it would have been almost impossible to correct any problems.
Well, operating at low altitude at high speed, there's very little room for error.
Now it's in the hands of an investigating team, including a doctor, a pilot of a plane who saw the crash, and other military personnel. They will sift through the few charred pieces of the plane and try to answer some of the questions. You can still see the remnants of the F-4 fighter in the Ouachita National Forest, and you can still smell the jet fuel a week after the crash. And there are other unnatural things in this burned-out section of the woods. People meticulously inspecting every piece of metal and wire lying on the ground. The crash site is dappled with pink and orange flags, marking places where important parts of the plane have been found. These tiny pieces may not look like much to the average person, but investigators say they can make the pieces fit together. Everything the team of experts finds that can be identified will be labeled, then plotted on a giant graph. Colonel Skip Yo says the team will scrutinize every aspect of the failed mission, the plane's structure and maintenance, its operations, and lastly, the possibility that the crash could have been operator error.
I don't want to look at that as a primary cause. Being an operator myself, I like to think that the pilot was doing everything in his power to fly the airplane safely. So it's certainly not an area we rule out. We have to look at that.
Colonel Yo and his associates have 30 days to finish their inspection and explain why the plane crashed. Until that time is up, they'll keep fitting the small pieces together, hoping the big story will fall into place.
that's been
rolling.
Okay.